Guy. So much for tuning in, logging on, and just hanging out with me and our esteemed panel of coding and compliance experts. So today, as always, I am joined by the infamous Christine Hall, Terry Fletcher, Stephanie Howard, Scott Kraft, and last but not certainly least, Paul Spencer. How is everybody?
Good.
Good. It's been a while.
Happy to
It
be
It
has
back.
been a
has.
while. It has been a while. So I'm excited to welcome everybody back. We have a great program for you today. Uh, we have been absent for a couple of weeks, and I'm going to put the blame on to everyone other than myself, but you know how that goes. I can do that. So today, uh, we have a great program, and it's a great lineup because there's so much going on in the industry. I know Christine, you and Stephanie were both at the AAPC conference. Do they still call themselves AAPC? You're on mute, Christine.
That's actually all they call themselves now.
Oh,
Just
Yes, they
AAPC.
do.
okay. Just
Christine, you're talking to nobody. You're on mute.
you're on mute, Christine.
That's probably a good thing. Yeah, we were both there. We were at HealthCon. A lot of great information.
That's about all you're gonna say.
Well, it was nice to see everybody. I will tell you though, getting back to in-person events was very exciting. So I'm doing a little bit of those this summer. Some in-person events, just shaking hands and seeing people and getting some good information.
Yeah, you know what was interesting to me, a couple of organizations that decided they wanted to do hybrids again this year are actually canceling because those hybrids led to more people signing up online than doing it in person. And one of them decided, well, you know, the cost just to do the online by itself was too great, so they completely canceled. And the other one basically said, well, since more people signed up for the online than the in person, we're just going to do all online. And I don't know. For me, there's just no substitute to being in person with people. Um,
Well, that's
you
where I
know,
just came from, Sean. I was telling everybody I just got off the red eye, came in screeching into the parking lot. But I went to a retreat in person, only in person, not hybrid. And it was amazing, amazing just to be in person together. And the information that happened and the networking that happened was priceless.
yeah. And I know, Christine, you're going to be speaking at the NSC HBC conference that's coming up. Where's that,
This
in
week.
Charleston?
Yeah, Charleston this week, this Wednesday, I'll be speaking there as well. So
Excellent. And again, another great organization. Should be
absolutely.
great in person opportunity for everybody. So, with that said, why don't we go ahead and why don't we jump into our very first of the topics? I wanted to start with AI. I wanted to start with artificial intelligence. And um, I think, again, not only because um, there's so much chatter about I think now we're starting to see Congress is taking it very seriously, and we're getting joint resolutions that are being put forth, um, from both parties saying, listen, we've got to regulate this thing. And, there's a lot of concern about it. So AI in healthcare, um, um, no, not artificial insemination, um, artificial intelligence. So, Chat GPT, right? Chat GPT has created a physician platform that allows providers or basically anybody to go in there and type in keywords, and it will create a progress note for the providers. And I went in there and played around with the platform for a little while and, put in some terms like, malignant hypertension, um, diabetes with a manifestation, and congestive heart failure as the problems. And it created this entire progress note. And it scared me, right? Because one, it had all kinds of citations for the places where it pulled information about those disease processes, right? So tell me the last time in a provider's progress note that you ever saw cited works or a footnote in an electronic health record, please.
No,
It's
very
funny.
long time.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah, that would be never, Sean.
Yeah, I was going to
Hey,
say
I
it's
would
also
say-
never.
I have seen it once, but it was related to a patient who was extremely complex and they were trying to support what they were doing
Okay.
because of medical necessity. But that was forever ago.
The only time I will even see anything that could masquerade as a citation is certain chronic diseases. The provider will have cooked up something in the template that says, like, some association or some body recommends that they eat a certain way or they do something.
Mhm.
That's about as close as I get.
Yeah.
Sometimes I tend to see it in the post-visit summary or the informational pamphlets that are given to the patient at the end of their encounter. But that's about as close as I've ever seen it.
Yeah. So here's the thing for me, right? I worry about the artificial intelligence from a couple of different perspectives. One, providers will become very dependent on those to mass produce documentation and not read what's actually in these progress notes, leading to explanations or information that's highly irrelevant, that doesn't pertain to the patient, that potentially during an audit will lead to a patient being labeled as having something more than what actually they potentially have, which could potentially make them uninsurable, right? But beyond that, I also worry about this artificial intelligence and doctors relying on these chat bots rather than going and engaging in dialogue with their peers. I don't care that ChatGPT was able to get a B+ on the bar exam. There's no substitution, like what we were saying, for in person, going to a conference as it is for providers to engage in dialogue with their peers to figure out. I mean, a computer's not going to be able to put a humanistic touch onto anything, right?
Well,
And
Sean, let
it's-
me interrupt real quick
Go ahead, please.
because what we're talking about in the ChatGPT world with healthcare is more about papers and citations and making a headline look pretty. But I'm still seeing physicians that have Alexa in their rooms and they're yelling, Alexa, how do you treat this sore throat? And they'll put something out and you'll hear it from another room, which to me that right there is a HIPAA violation. But you'll hear it and the doctors are yelling because we yell in our house when we want Alexa to turn on the lights. And it's just funny because I've had a patient, I was shadowing a physician recently, and the patient was in there saying, how does Alexa know what's correct? And the doctor said, well, I'm sure there's some physician information behind it. The look on the patient's face of sheer panic was like, so you're sure? Are you,
Terry,
you really
they said
sure?
it in the room with the patient?
Yes, I
Oh
was
my
sitting
God.
there. Yeah, the patient had to have approval for me to be there, and the doctor said, "I want you to see how my, virtual assistant works." And so I was listening because I don't like it, and I was like, "This is what you do for every patient." So then I went and sat in the waiting room to see how much I could hear because he was yelling, and I could hear all of it. So I could hear from room to room, Alexa, and I was just like, "You've got to be kidding me!" But when the patient questioned, and to me this was probably the first primitive AI that we saw before we were seeing the Chat GPT. the patient's like, where is Alexa getting this information from? Amazon? I mean, seriously. So I'm getting kind of annoyed with the fact that nobody wants to do their own work. They want everybody else to do it for them. And the cut and paste we went from, then we went to Alexa, and now we're Chat GPT. Pretty soon, the bots are going to be taking over the universe. And to Sean's point, I don't know. I have a problem with all of it, but I think some people think, oh no, it's the best thing ever because of research. But to the panel, isn't everything that is, the AI, isn't it programmed by a person? So we have to trust the person that they have the knowledge of that information. And how do we do that? I mean, it's I guess it's kind of like flying on an airplane somewhere and you don't introduce yourself to the pilot. I mean, some people might, and you just trust it. So this is a problem for me because I'm seeing the progression of it. And instead of going back to the reality of healthcare and that face to face with the patient and using that physician's knowledge, we're using abstract knowledge. And I don't know if I like that or not. I'm not saying it's not fun to play around with, but to me, you're going to have some issues coming up.
Well, let me say this, and now I'll turn it over to the panel. The thing that scares me about using artificial intelligence when trying to make a determination as a surgeon, especially young surgeons just out of school, out of residency, whatever it may be, is that while the bot may look through all of the different information contained within its library, if you will, the bot can't make a determination as to whether or not the patient actually should go for surgery versus whether or not the doctor should take a let's sit, wait, and see approach as they would get from probably engaging with other surgeons of their specialty who have seen the symptomology, the problems, the progression of the disease or the injury or the problem or the waiting 24 to 36 to 48 hours so the patient could turn the corner before we make the determination to go in and just cut, right? So
But
that's
Sean,
part of it.
do you think part of this is because they've lowered the standards for physicians now? You don't have to take the MCAT. You don't have to be, take your residency for certain things if you want to be an assistant physician, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm sure there's a lot of things that are contributing to a whole lot of the problems in the healthcare industry right now. And, I go back and I look at this and I say, listen, the guy who is dubbed the godfather of artificial intelligence, I think he was with Google. He came out and, he gave congressional testimony where he started off by saying, I need to apologize for what's happening right now. And the reason why I built it was because I knew if I didn't, somebody else was going to. But we need government regulation. We need government intervention. And we've got to do something because these machines will eventually become the master and we will be beholden to those. So let me open it up to Scott, Paul, Christine, Stephanie, anybody who wants to go at it.
My wheels started turning as you're talking. What about the errors that might come up from using Chat GPT, the bots, the AI, whatever, that can contribute to maybe med malpractice? Is your medical malpractice insurance carrier going to cover you because the error was due to the bot that you used to create that note? And think of that, how it's going to affect continuity of care or transfer of care. If that information is incorrect and it goes over to a specialist who's relying on that information, I mean, I see the nightmare there. My last concern is, now that the genie's out of the bottle, how do we put it back in? We've had a hard time with providers using the EMRs as tools and continuing to document the medical necessity, whether it's EMR or paper or whatever. Now that we've added another factor of AI, right? How do we take them even a further step back to be more compliant in their documentation, to support in their documentation for all of those things.
Yeah, I mean the wheels are definitely turning quite a bit here as well. It's funny when Terry started talking about AI, and I even think about like the very rudimentary AI that we've had for a few years, where the how many times does a provider tell us that the system told them this was moderate complexity based on these inputs? In reality, these are inputs that human beings have created that have led us to a place, and if you put the wrong thing in, you'll get the wrong thing out, right? And I think that AI is just that, like times a thousand. Like AI to me is really just an inordinate amount of aggregated knowledge that the chat system is going to process faster than we can, but it's not an individual thing. One of the things I heard about AI sort of in my own non-working life is somebody who was maybe optimistic about it said that AI is not going to take your job. Somebody who understands AI, that person may take your job. And AI is not going away. So fundamentally, I think what we have to do is not necessarily anticipate that nobody's going to use it, but we have to make sure that to the extent people are engaged in it, they understand what the risks are. They understand it correctly. And the last thing that Sean got me to thinking about, and I know that Sean, Terry, and I are the baseball fans, and we might be the only ones. And baseball has evolved over the years to there's so much statistical data that decisions are often made at 30,000 feet, where in other words, like the manager will basically have a data set that says, I can't let this pitcher face this batter like a third time, even though the manager's eyes may say that the pitcher is pitching the best game he's pitched all year. And when we started to talk about surgical decisions and chat bots and artificial intelligence, a surgical decision is really about an individual surgeon and the unique idiosyncrasies and health factors of an individual patient. And my concern about artificial intelligence is those decisions start to be made at a higher level based on things like statistical probability, and the physician's attention is focused more on that and less about like what the needs of an individual patient are. And I don't know if that made sense. And probably all the people that don't like baseball are like, what's he talking about? But it really has been an evolution away from I'm going to make an individual decision based on my years of training and expertise and what my eyes tell me versus like I have sheets of paper and that's going to decide. And look, the nice thing about that in some ways when you're the decider is when you make the wrong decision, you just hold up the paper and you say, well, it's just what this told me to do. And so that's a concern of mine with respect to like the personal touch of medicine going down a path like that.
Yeah.
And
Go
That's
ahead.
what I was thinking too.
yeah, so I was going to say one of the things, and I forget how many months ago I saw this, but there was a news article that came out that talked about the largest EMR system was partnering and implementing AI. And, it just has me thinking because, in general, as a part of the audits, a lot of what we're looking at is not just surface level what the documentation looks like. But for me, for example, when I find a problem, I go back and ask questions about the EMR system. There are certain more manual systems that some of my clients use that I know that if there's a particular type of error, it's driven by a template that they're using. So it's not just talking with the physician, it's also talking with the vendor or, their internal IT department. So one of the things that, we need to be thinking about as an organization, if you purchase an EMR system, is the fact that they're not always built from the perspective of compliance. Now, I'm sure that they have attorneys on staff. I'm sure that they, state that to a certain level they do remain compliant. But there are things that I see in different EMR systems that should not even physically be an option that are causing large compliance issues on the back end. For example, one of the things I'm still going through, and I've seen this over and over again with different clients, is that the way that a patient encounter is set up when they present to the office drives the ability to sign off on a note, and it doesn't always show the signature of the person who saw the patient. Why is that something that was built into a system that allows for, non-compliant documentation? So these different tools may be in there. They may start to help the workflow of your practice, but we still have to be looking at the compliance level, whether or not you should be using it, or if other, stopgaps need to be put into place. Um, to really tackle, that compliance side, because just because it's there doesn't mean that it's okay to use.
Yeah, I think obviously there's a lot that has to be fleshed out, right? And it's going to be interesting to see what steps Congress takes in the coming weeks and months, especially leading into 2024, which is an election year. Um, I know we have a lot of other things that are uh, big ticket topics for the 2024 election, but AI is up there. And AI is one of these things that is dominating a lot of the conversations. And I think we're going to hear more about it. Now, Paul, you actually have a different device, right? You have um, you have a Google Mini, not an actual Alexa, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So real quick, give us give us an example of what you find when, and it's so funny. I just said Alexa, and because we have one that's in the other room, it just said, I'm not sure what you're asking me. Is that not frightening how I am all the way on the other side in this thing? Don't tell me these folks aren't listening to what
Yeah.
we're saying, but
Well,
we'll come back to that in a minute. Go ahead.
Well, on that same uh, line of thinking, my living room is on the other side of this wall, and when this office door is open on the weekends, and my wife and I are having conversations about specific things, suddenly Google wants to chime in with their 2 cents, which is a little bit disturbing. But all of us as auditors and all of us as coders, for those of us who've been around a long time, uh, we remember that the 1995 guidelines and then subsequently the building of templates in electronic medical record system. One of our favorite phrases was garbage in, garbage out. And that's really what we're dealing with AI. I consider this the difference between evidential versus existential, and the evidence that a chatbot has or an artificial intelligence apparatus has is only as good as the information that's been fed into it. And we're not talking about geography or what's the main crop of Burundi. We're talking about the science of medicine, and it's something that's been fine-tuned from the time of medieval barbers and the bleeding of leeches to what we have today. You know, it has evolved because men of science and people took that information and evolved that science into where it is today. So uh, I tend to think of it as this is yet one more gimmick in the holster of humanity to try to make humanity easier. But at the end of the day, humanity, the verb, is the only thing that's going to save humanity, the noun.
Well, and I would just add to that. I think with a lot of this artificial intelligence, it's really about how to make sure we get. I think a lot of these things are designed to make people more efficient. At least that's the idea on paper. And how do you get the pickup of the efficiency without, a lot of these other stories, right? I think a lot of us may have seen that story from last week where the attorney turned in like a legal filing and it was generated via AI and all of the citations were just made up, right? And so how do you, I mean, as someone who writes a number of reports over the course of the year, a lot of times, I'm in this nexus where if I took all of the different things that I said commonly in reports and tried to keep them in a file, it would be too difficult to find that individual paragraph versus just retyping whatever that thing is I'm going to say for the 9,000th time, right? And so there are areas in which artificial intelligence can assist us. It can make us more efficient. It can be like a multiplier of our time and capability, but we also have to understand like what the real risks are, right? Like how it could steer patient care wrong, how it could violate HIPAA. It really is in some ways another form of I won't say progress yet. I'll say advancement in our society, right? And if you go back and you look through history, that's all it really is. I was talking to some friends over the weekend about how we can fly across the country in 6 hours, and it used to take Thomas Jefferson 3 days to get from Central Virginia to Washington D.C. Right? Like these are all progress things, but we also have to mitigate the fact that they have to be used a certain way. And now that the genie is out of the bottle, we're not going to put it back in. So the question really becomes, what's the right way to use these tools? What are the regulatory infrastructures that we may need? Because right now we're sort of in that wild, wild west phase of like, here's a new thing that we're still trying to figure out exactly what it does. And the problem is when you're in that mode and you're using it in the setting of a patient who may be a surgical candidate, that's a bit different.
Uh, I, I, I think that's a very fair statement. I think this is also interesting here, and I agree. The use of AIs will result in the exponential multiplication of errors. I agree 100%. I think that's spot on. All right, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens as we continue to, see how AI integrates more and more into the healthcare space. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of proposed legislation comes out of Congress. My guess is it's going to be bipartisan because this will probably be one of the only things these folks can agree on for the next several months. But we'll stay on top of it. All right, Terry, I want to go to you next because you had a topic with respect to the telehealth and the Q3014 HCPCS level 2 code, if I'm not mistaken, with site of service fees. So let's jump into that and let's see what's going on there.
So there was something that came out, and there's been, I don't want to say errors, but there's been conflicting information. Let's put it that way, on when a practice can or a facility can bill something called a Q3014, and it's only worth like $25. I think it's actually allowed at $27.72 right now. And what it is it's for what we call the distant site, which is where the patient is if they are, and not in their home. So the patient isn't in their home. They actually had to go to some facility to be able to see the, the originating site. The distant site is where the physician is. So originating site is where the patient is, distant site's where the physician is. So we're actually going back to pre-pandemic definitions. But this $27 is, some practices are trying to bill for it when the patient is being seen by one of their physicians within the organization. So it's like a multi-specialty organization. The patient actually comes to, just for argument's sake, let's say the primary care office, they see a specialist within under their same umbrella, tax ID, in a distant site. And the question comes up, can we bill for that Q3014 for the originating site? Well, for me, that was always the outpatient facility or the hospital or the place where they basically had the machines and a telehealth technician to make sure the connection was fine. And then they really had no input or any kind of reimbursement involvement in the distant site where the physician is. So the question came up is, can we also bill that even though we're under the same umbrella as the distant site? And my response to that, without being able to find a specific answer, is no, because you have reimbursement sharing of the distant site provider, of the specialist. So to me, if you are, even though they're coming to your facility and it's not necessarily the doctor that's there, that wouldn't be something you can also charge for. And you have to be careful with duplication because you don't want to invite the risk, and in lack of having a specific guideline or published guidance on what to do, err on the conservative side. Don't do it. So I see people saying, well, I'm going to err on the other side to see if they catch me. Why would you ever do that? So I see people doing that all the time, saying, well, if they audit me, then I'll deal with it then. There's no if.
I've seen that too, Terry. I saw during the public health emergency that that HCPCS level was reported. The patient was in their home.
Yeah,
so they're reporting the evaluation and management service and reporting the Q code. And I was the same thing. Where's the rationale behind that?
Right. Right, because the
It
patient's the one hooking themselves up and all
right.
that. Now, I understand this was to me a little bit of a conflicting response, only because they actually were in a facility, but because they shared in the reimbursement for the other physician that actually saw them, I just believe that that would be incorrect. So, just something to put out there. When all else fails, go to best practices, because you're not going to have published guidance on everything, which probably leads us to a second topic, Sean, on patient initiation that we were talking about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't
Can I just kind of go into
yeah,
that real quick?
why don't you just go forward with that, and then
Okay.
let's just go ahead and go around the
Go
table.
around, yeah. So a question came up over the weekend, and I know all of us on the panel, even though we say we work 5 days a week, we work seven. We're always checking in. There's email. There's always something, and we try very hard not to look at it. Never works. So one thing that came in is a question from one of my members that said, I have a membership, and they said, so our doctor wants to know where is the published resource and the site that says what patient initiation is. I'm like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And they're like, well, since e-visits and phone calls have to be patient initiated, audio only, why, what does that mean? Well, a lot of things aren't published because they're considered to be common sense or self-explanatory. Patient initiated means the patient's the one that starts the process. But I wanted to dig into this further because I really did want to have a site for the provider that asked, because to me, if you're going to ask the question, it means you want to do it right. At least you want to do it right. And we appreciate the question. So we never want to minimize that. Well, I had to go all the way to the United Kingdom to find something. And they have something, and it's called PIFU, Patient Initiated Follow Up. So the first thing that says to me is that it is for established patients. And actually, that feeds into the fact that e-visits and audio visits are for established patients. But here's what it says. It says, patient-initiated follow-up is when a patient initiates an appointment when they need one based on their symptoms and individual circumstance. The physician does not call them or check in on them or contact them to schedule an appointment or follow-up. If that is the case, then audio only or e-visit is not appropriate. And I'm going to send it over because I know Stephanie and Christine, I think Scott was telling me they have issues with this. If you are seeing a patient for an encounter in the office and you're counting your data point as ordering a test, you are not allowed to then schedule an audio only phone call for the patient to then give them the result of that test. You already got paid for that, and that is not initiating. Also, I see practices doing that within the 7 days that they were seen, which again, another reason not to do it, because you have a 7-day global on phone calls. So I'm going to send it over to Stephanie. You mentioned something this morning, so I'll send it to you and see what you're getting.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's interesting, some of the questions I'm getting surrounding this are with clients that are newer that I really wasn't helping during the pandemic. And then some clients were pretty quiet over the scope of the past year or two. And now all of a sudden I'm getting new questions and they're like, hey, can we do this now? I'm like, no, not only can you not do this now, you should not have been doing it during the pandemic. But, this is a big problem, Terry, because what I'm finding is that the practices have put into their workflow a process that does not have medical necessity for billing. So during the pandemic, they looked at it as a way, for example, when we think about results in that phone call, that was a way where the patient had a test, they automatically scheduled a call. Great, now we've got more revenue. Now, afterwards, where things hopefully have changed, they're like, oh, wait a second, now we have this big workflow. What do we do about this situation? And I even have a situation where one of the clients, they created the workflow during the pandemic, but now that they're not doing as much telehealth, some of those patients are even coming into the practice for a normal test result, and it's just become a part of the workflow because they were setting up what they felt was a billable audio only or at least telehealth visit of some sort. So, when we think about patient initiated, the one thing that I always advise is you have to remember that there are patient dollars attached to what you are doing. Some of the providers I talk to, even if it were to be billable, they're just like, no, I can't do that. I'm not charging my patient for this. It was a 5-minute call. And then others are like, yeah, I want to bill out everything I think I can get paid for and not think about that part. But if it is a billable service, your patient could have out of pocket costs. So it's not like you're just flying under the radar and getting reimbursed from the insurance. This has an impact on the patient as well. Not to mention the fact that if you are audited, how are you going to show that that patient requested and wanted to have that particular visit, which in the end results in no treatment, no testing, no management, and you really have nothing to back that up.
We had that personally happen in our family. I went to an ENT doctor. They ordered imaging, then called and said, you need to come in to have the imaging read to you. Said, is there any problems? We can't tell you that. So I got a hold of the imaging. Everything was unremarkable. There was nothing to discuss, and there would have been no treatment to order post review of imaging. It was a normal imaging, but they refused to give the results of the imaging. They refused to say that it was within normal limits without having me come back in to make that appointment to see it. It's a specialist. I'm paying specialist copay to go see, to hear everything is within normal limits. There's
That's
nothing
crazy.
else to do. No more treatment necessary.
And I have practices that are scheduling the appointment during the encounter. They're saying, well, we're gonna do an audio only appointment for you in about a week to go over your test results. No, you can't do that.
Yes.
That's not patient initiated. Again, you already got paid. Thank you, Carrie, for the comment on your TCM audit. You said you found out that was correct. But one thing I put in the chat, and Paul and I were agreeing on this. Somebody asked, would patient initiated be the same as PRN? So at the end of a note, sometimes you'll see at end of the encounter, it'll say PRN or patient return is needed, meaning now that the patient is well enough or to the point of their care at goal where now they can now make the decision when to come back. So I think that has a play in the patient initiated, but what I look when I see PRN is I look that's going to affect the risk of that encounter. So, you can't really say that you did all this stuff, but then the patient can come back whenever they feel is needed and think that's a high risk encounter. I've seen level 5s with PRN on. I'm like, really? No, that's not going to happen. So a little different there.
I think another thing we're going to see as we get to those audits are going to be the audits from 2020. I know I've heard this multiple times that during the public health emergency, especially during 2020, that there were a lot of physicians that had advised their staff, just start calling patients. We're going to have a telehealth visit with them. We're going to have a follow-up visit for telehealth that was not previously scheduled or previously ordered. So with return within 3 months or no, they started scheduling those patients for telehealth visits just because of the fear of loss of revenue during the public health emergency. And we're going to see those audits come through. It will come out in the wash. I have faith that we're going to catch this type of almost solicitation, forcing them to incur these charges. So
I had real quick, and then we'll hand it over. I had an extreme situation where a patient had finished surgery. The primary care provider was aware that they had surgery. They weren't even involved in the process. They just knew that they had it. They called them up, asked how they were doing the week afterwards. The patient received a bill, and the billed amount, I think it was around $250, to just call and say, oh, you're doing okay. You're following up with your surgeon. Great. And that was the extent. They didn't even know why their PCP was calling them.
Sean, we need some face plant emojis that just come up on the screen when we get those.
Yeah, those would be interesting.
Those
would be interesting. Go ahead, Paul.
It's so interesting to me that when we mandated that electronic medical records were used, a part of electronic medical records was you have to have a secure way to contact the patient and to have a patient portal and to have all that information on the portal. And then apparently we're still using a very analog system of, well, you've got to come back and visit us for the results, instead of what my doctor has been doing for over 10 years. He draws labs. The labs get uploaded into the portal in less than a day. And I see, yes, I have to stop eating red meat and control my cholesterol again for the next 6 months. I mean, it's a little bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, Paul, is very similar to yours, and I think some of the examples we're talking about here, it's I hate to say it, but it's not much of a head scratcher to me. It's a practice that's trying to get extra revenue in the door at the expense of their patients. And if I had a provider force me to physically return to an office, let alone try to charge me for a telephone call to tell me that the result of a diagnostic test was that it was fine, um, that would not probably be a super pleasant experience when I heard that. Just in terms of what I would say, and we can talk about the regulatory and compliance stuff, and that's certainly very important. But it also does a disservice to your patients. It disrespects their time. And when you wonder what leads patients to file complaints, what lead patients to do some of the things that may result in you finding yourself in deeper trouble later, it's some of these types of activities, right, where you're sort of foisting a charge onto somebody, for something like a normal test result. I mean, this technology has been available for a number of years, to communicate results. When I have blood work drawn, my doctor says I'll put it in the portal, but if it's something I need to call you about, I'll call you.
Mhm. And Sean and I can tell you that physicians always trying to squeeze the last dollar out of their patients with extraneous services always ends well with audit entities around the country, doesn't it, Sean?
Well, and it's just a flow item, right? Like I think we've heard the point before where a provider will say, like, call the office if you don't hear back from us in a certain amount of time, right? Like, would I consider that to be patient initiated? No, not in the realm of a follow up of a test. Patient initiated. It's kind of funny. We started this exchange off by saying that the definition of patient initiated seems fairly obvious, and I still am kind of struggling with that, right? It's like the patient has decided to reach out to you for guidance without any prompting by you, whatsoever, right? And so if it's not that, it's probably not patient initiated.
Well, and keep in mind what the UK language said, and that is a cited source. It said based on their individual circumstance and symptoms. So it's independent or separate from what the doctor may have said, call back in for this particular situation. But one of the things I'm also getting is why can't we bill new patient visits under audio only? Because the definition of audio only says don't do it. It says that is established. But the other part is CMS has said discontinue the use of waivers when no longer needed. How do you prove that you need an audio only new patient visit? How do you do it? Especially now with all of the Medicaid and with all of the commercial plans and with the language in Medicare that basically says that you have to even document now why your patient couldn't do an audio and video. I mean, that's now in the rules. So stretching it to saying, well, I'm still using the new patient for audio only and trying to get that kind of money for that is just it makes no sense to me. And we always use the phrase, I know Paul said the old phrase of garbage in, garbage out. Well, the new phrase seems to be make it make sense, and that doesn't make sense. So it needs to make sense. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time always being in the defensive position of why you did something. And all of us have been involved in helping practices when they get an audit request, all of us on this panel, and I'm sure some of you that are listening in. And it's not pretty. It's not fun. It's probably part of our job that we'd rather not have. And having to find loopholes or find out if your intent was, or why you didn't, was it really deliberate ignorance? What was the reason that you didn't know how the rules were, and how do you support that? And we don't want you to get into a position where you're always having to support your actions instead of I did this because, and it's pretty easy. So just be caution on that. I mean, we are the compliance guy, and we want you to be compliant. That's the best way to put it, I guess.
And keep in mind too that, there are times where a patient complaint to their payer will trigger an audit. They may not pull, a large sample, but they will contact the office or whoever it is right away. I say whoever because with some of our clients, they've contacted internal counsel. But if a patient were like in that extreme situation where they see a thing come through where they billed the insurance $250 to ask how they were after surgery, that could initiate a patient complaint to the payer, and then they're going to be investigating that. Terry, I don't know if you know this part with the work that you have with the payers, but from what I've heard from our clients who have had this situation, they've been able to clarify for the insurance and rectify with no problem. But the insurance has had to investigate within so many hours. It seemed to me almost like 24, 48, something like that.
Well, it's different with every contract, but we're finding that
Okay.
contracts are giving the payers more open-ended how long they have to go back. But physicians, they're tied to a little bit more stringent timelines on what they have to do.
Okay.
So, but they can go back mostly, or most of them are 4 years. I've seen 4 years they can go back and take a look. And so I'm thinking that's going to work to their advantage with a 3-year pandemic. So I think 2020, like Christine said, is going to be a nightmare for Medicare. I saw all the non-compliance and just so many liberties taken with telehealth. And remember, one of the things that just in Medicare that they put in all of their information, and it was to cover them, is they put in there, did you act in bad faith or were you acting in good faith? And what is that definition? So it's not what you think is good faith or bad faith, it's what the payer thinks. And if Medicare thinks that you acted in bad faith, I don't know how else to put it. God help you, because bad faith is really bad. It's not a good thing that you want to be labeled as, and it can come back not only just for those encounters on that particular audit, but you can now be on a watch list, and I would hate to see that happen.
Absolutely. All right. So the last topic that we have today, and I think this is a really good one. And Terry, I'll let you set the scene because this was sort of your thought. Statistical sampling in an audit. So let me give that to you, and then I'll come right behind you with all of the requirements.
Okay, so one of the things that comes up with audits, and I know a lot of us, again, some of you get on this podcast to figure out how to handle your audits. I know I see Pam on there and different Alfreda, different listeners that we appreciate you being there every week with us. One of the things that we've noticed is that, and especially in all of our audits that we do, and auditing is a really big deal right now. It payers, not just Medicare, but commercial plans are seeing what Medicare is recouping. And so they want to kind of get in on the act and get in the party there. But also I'm noticing more and more practices finally have opened up dollars and money and budgets for auditing. They really were tight on it before, but they're like, maybe we should be a little proactive here and see what's going on. Well, a lot of times I will get a request, and I actually just got one. Can you just look at 5 records for me? No. Okay. No, I can't. If you want me to look at something, it needs to be what we call a statistically valid sample. So that might mean something different to different people. I know Doctors Management has probably a statistician that does that. I know Christine and I, who are independent consultants, I know we have different things that we use for that. But I kind of mirror myself after what Medicare does. And Medicare likes to see at least 10 records, up to 30, for a specific code based on what they're doing. So if somebody says, I want to see if my new patient visit 5s or my established patient visit 5s are good, I'll get a mix of that, minimum 10 up to 30 per provider. But is that somewhere in writing? Is that something that says that is what a statistically, a valid sample is? I'm seeing it a little different for different payers. So Sean, I'll throw it back to you on what the legalities of that is.
Yeah, so not so much the legalities, but here's the deal, right? So in order for something to be considered a statistically valid sample, at least per the Medicare Program Integrity Manual, it needs to have somewhere between 30 to 40 dates of service. Anything less than that, they do not, by CMS definition, consider that to be a statistically valid sample. And they specifically address that under the Targeted Probe and Educate program. Now, when we get into a discussion about statistical sampling, I think the first thing that you need to recognize is that, excuse me, a statistical sample is used to estimate the amount of an overpayment that's made on claims that have already been processed, right? So if you go back and you look at the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act of 2003, short, you could just call it the MMA. What it does is that it specifically mandates that before using an extrapolation, right? Again, when we talk about extrapolation, we're talking about projections, extensions, expansions of known data sets. In order to be able to determine the overpayment amounts to be recovered by recoupment or offset or some other mechanism, there has to be a determination of sustained. And this is what's so critical, folks. There has to be a determination of sustained or high level of payment error, or documentation that educational intervention has failed to correct the payment that's in error. And folks, by law, the determination that a sustained or high level of payment error exists is not subject to any administrative or judicial review. So I always drive everybody to go to Chapter 8 of the Program Integrity Manual. And the first part that you need to look at is Section 8.4.1.3, which are the steps for conducting a statistical sample. Now, you'll hear terms that are used like SVRS, which stands for Statistically Valid Random Sample. Now, there are major steps that are required, and there's actually 8 of them that are required in order to perform a statistical sample. And I'm not going to bore you with what those steps are, but take a look at, as I said, it's Chapter 8, Section 8.4.1.3, and they recently updated this on April 21st of 2023, and it was implemented May 22nd of 2023. Now, when you follow that section, you'll move into the next portion, which is 8.4.1.4, which is determining when statistical sampling can be used. And as I said, and this is what's really important, this section has actually been changed, because it used to say that a sustained or high error rate is that which is greater than 50% or more of an error rate. Well, under the TPE program, I believe anything above a 20% error rate constitutes grounds for them to repeat the next level and to use statistical sampling. The most important part of Chapter 8, where I always drive people to go, and I talk about this extensively when I am in court and there are questions that are being raised either by the defense counsel during direct examination or during cross-examination by the prosecution. There are specific requirements that have to be met as far as who can actually pull the sample frames, right? They need to be people that actually have the requisite skills. They should be statisticians. You can use economists. They could use people that have been formally trained in statistical sampling, predictive analytic modeling. So, Terry, to your point, within doctors management, we have, the mighty Frank Cohen, who has been one of the most celebrated computational statisticians in the history of this industry. And I've been blessed to study under him for 28 years. I always encourage folks to look at, when you're in Chapter 8 of the Program Integrity Manual, to go to 8.4.2 and to start with that section there, because that's where they go into probability sampling. And then it gets into the selection of period for review, because there they start talking about point estimates. They start talking about the error rates. They start talking about all the critical components, testing. What type of simulation did you use? Did you use a Monte Carlo simulation? Did you use Cochrane's theory for testing? Was it a two-sided blind, test, or a t-test or an s-test that was done? So all kinds of things that need to be known. What we usually find when we are looking at overpayment demands that come from a UPIC, and Paul has seen this. We had a client just recently that got hit for a $1.2 million demand on an overpayment based on the extrapolation by the UPIC. And when we went back and we challenged it, the UPIC actually rescinded the entire demand for refund. So, I mean, that was $1.2 million that the UPIC had to rescind. We find a lot of times with the commercial insurance companies, you know, they will say that they did a statistically valid random sample. No, they didn't. They're lying to you.
A lot of cherry picking.
A lot of cherry picking. And the easiest way to know that they're full of poo-poo is to send a letter back to them that says, please provide us with either a CD or a share file link that will provide us with the mechanism used, meaning, did you use SAS? Did you use Meditab? Did you use RATstat, you know, to select your sample frame? How did you test it? We want to see the sample frames. We want to see the point estimates. We want to see the error rates. And usually what you will get is, are you open to having a settlement discussion with us so that we can see where your heads are at to be able to settle this outstanding amount? And then we know that they're full of crap. Oh, excuse me, poo-poo. All right, so let me
Now-
stop there.
Well,
Any-
Sean, I have a question on this one.
Please.
So one of the reasons I brought up the topic, and maybe Scott and Paul, you guys can respond to this too. When a provider asks for an audit and they're coming to us, so we know their payer audits, we know what they figure out. What is, in your opinion, and Scott, I'll throw it to you, what is a statistically valid sample? Do you do it based on one code? Do you do it based on the whole E&M section? Do you base it on one procedure? What is it that you think would be appropriate from your experience as far as a sample?
I mean, I think it depends upon the type of the audit, right? Like if we're talking about a statistically valid sample in the construct of this conversation, I don't think we're looking at anything that much different. I think what tends to happen in my world is, you know, for better or for worse, at least at the initial audit step, it's almost like more of a probe into the codes that they believe are at heightened risk without necessarily having the volumes for each individual code, at least at that initial level. But, you know, to be honest with you, based on what we find, and I'm sure you see the same thing, the next level is convincing them that what we see as a potential problem is in fact a problem, because you know they're looking for a lot of things. They're looking for ways to boost their billing, they're looking for ways to boost their revenue, but somewhere out there they perceive risk differently, and I think that they tend to look for, like, give me the extreme risk, right? Like if I tell them there's a risk, but the risk is one modest degree of risk, at least in terms of how they see it, then they don't necessarily want to go on. So that's a bit of a long answer, but you know, we have to really prod when we believe statistical validity has any meaning, right? Like we oftentimes have to prod the client to want to see things in that volume. The client just kind of wants to know, where am I not making enough money? Where am I at some sort of outerlying risk?
Yep.
And I also get that where they're saying something like, I want an audit. So, and if my level 5s aren't working, can you tell me what I need to say so that they are level 5s?
Right, right. Their response
my
tends
favorite.
to be, tell me how to make it into,
Yeah.
tell me how to make it into this. And you know, sometimes I want to say, well, you know, put a hidden thing in the parking lot so that the patient trips over it and like lands on her face, then it might be a level 5, right? So, and I mean, I say that kiddingly, right? But it's kind of like what you're asking me is make the patient sicker somehow. I can't really do that. Like what they have is what they have.
Well, I've got
Yeah.
doctors now that are infighting in between their group, or they're in the same group. And I have a doctor that comes to me and says, this doctor's billing all level 4s, and that's impossible. And I'm billing level 2, 3s, 4s, and I never would touch a 5. So can you audit him? I'm like, whoa, you guys are in the same group and you're infighting within the group. Sorry.
Well,
Paul, I didn't mean to
they're
interrupt.
really interesting conversations, just in terms of, I have them within groups sometimes about how different providers approach the same problems. And I think with these guidelines in particular, you will sometimes see providers who, every lab under the sun is getting ordered based on a presenting problem, and the next provider is just like, take some leave, and if it's not better in 2 weeks, come back. And it's just a very different mechanism of treatment, but then the question ends up being the same, right? Like, or the one provider will say, well, I think that provider is gaming the system because that's the way they're treating the patient. And that's kind of a hard judgment for us to make.
Well, very quickly, to get back to the original question of what constitutes a statistically valid random sample, there are a few different ways you can do it. The first way, and our preferred way, is to do some type of data analytics to see just what services are, make up the preponderance of their day-to-day activities. Try to zero in on the services that they're providing on a regular basis and start there. And you either come up with either justifications for that billing pattern, or you end up with services that are being over-reported based on the nature and the complexity of the services that are being provided. It's something of a simplistic answer to a very complicated question, but at the end of the day, you really have to focus audit activities on what they're doing in real time, before you get to any other place that says this is what you're going to be doing after our engagement, and this is what you need to get. We're never going to say, there's no such thing as a phrase that pays. If there are any physicians in the audience, please internalize that, because I'm never going to give you one. It's going to be based on the individual factors of each patient coming in the door.
I just wanted to put in there, though, there are times that what we're actually doing is more of a review, not necessarily an audit. An audit's the word that I hear a lot. Can you audit? Well, I'm not going to do a statistical sample. I'm going to just go in and, maybe look at today and see if a small sample to review for opportunities for educational purposes that don't necessarily have the same responsibilities that an audit would have. So I just wanted to pop that in real quick, that sometimes we use the word audit when we go into practices, but maybe it's just a review, because it's not a statistical sample. We're not looking at it from an overpayment perspective. We're looking to see for educational opportunities.
And that's a great point. And that's one of the things, and I'll end on this note. That's one of the things that I always explain, because Paul gets to do a lot of discovery calls with me, and I'll have somebody say, well, we need to do a statistical sample. And I say, well, are you planning to issue a refund? Well, no, we want it for educational purposes. Well, then you don't want a statistically valid random sample. You want a probability sample, or you want a convenient sample, because we use a statistically valid sample when we are preparing to issue a refund, or we believe that we're going to have to issue a refund. So be careful on the terms that you use. Make sure that you're getting in touch with people that actually do this on a regular basis and can help you through that process. All right. That's going to do it for this episode of the Monday Coding and Compliance Roundtable. As always, I want to say thank you to Paul, Terry, Stephanie, Christine, Scott for being ever present on the podcast today. It was a great discussion. I feel like we just started and we're already over an hour. So great conversation. Thanks to each and every single one of you who has tuned in, logged on, and hung out with us while we were live. And to all of those of you who are going to be watching us on the replay or listening to us on the actual podcast version. I'll be back tomorrow with Terry Fletcher and our hashtag Terry Tuesday, now that she's back from her vacation to Napa, which was not authorized by me. And later this week, I'll have Ashley Morgan, Robert Lyles for another Legal with Lyles Parker. We will also have a fantastic episode coming up this week with Eric Rubenstein and the recently converted from the dark side to the rebellion, David Traskey, who is the former attorney for the Office of the Inspector General Counsel. So it's OSIG. the Office of Counsel to the Inspector General, excuse me, as I was trying to get the words out of my mouth. So really excited to have those two guys on the podcast later this week. Until then, remember, be good to yourself, but more importantly, y'all be good to each other. Take care.